Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah McFall. I'm part of the executive team here at the Water Services Authority, Taumata Arawai. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We've been really pleased by the level of interest in this session. So hopefully it will be really informative, and we will cover off some of the highlights and key points about the standards. I'll give you a quick run through of what we're going to cover off in this session. And one of the things I just want to note is we plan to record this information session and put it on our website, and we will also make the slides available for those people who couldn't attend today but are interested in getting a bit more detail about the standards. Also, because of the number of people on the call, we won't be doing a live Q&A either during or at the end of the information session, but we will cover off the most common questions that we received during the registration process through the slides, and we also have a section at the end where we'll also touch on some of the most frequently asked questions that we received, and then we'll also share an email address that you can use if your question hasn't been answered and you want to talk to any of the team. So we'll cover off today some of the background and context about the wastewater standards. We'll also go into more detail about what the final set of standards require, looking at each one in turn. We will go into detail about the transition arrangements and implementation, and then a little bit about what next before we get into some of the frequently asked questions and how to reach out to us and contact us. Before we go into that, I just want to thank many of the people on the call who have worked with us along the way. So we received a lot of really useful and insightful feedback through the consultation period. And we've also been engaging with a number of councils, groups, iwi, individuals throughout the process, and people have been very generous with their insights, their feedback, and their input into this process. And you'll see as we go into detail about the standards, we made quite a few changes as a result of that engagement and feedback. And so we're very grateful for the time and effort people put into this. We think that has made given us a really robust and credible set of standards. So if we just go into the first set of slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit, give a bit of an overview of us and why we set out to develop these wastewater standards. So as you can see here, we have an oversight role when it comes to wastewater and stormwater. And what this means is that we play a national level role in being able to set standards, being able to set targets, and doing public reporting. However, we're not the primary regulator for wastewater and stormwater, so we don't grant consents and we don't enforce wastewater consents. That sits with the regional councils. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why we chose to look at wastewater standards as one of the first activities along in our function of oversight in wastewater and stormwater. So we saw a real need to step into this space. You can see here from this slide an overview of wastewater treatment plant consents. And you can see that about 60% of them will come up for reconsenting in the next decade. And we already have about 20% of wastewater treatment plants that are operating on expired resource consents. So it was a critical time, we thought, to put in some certainty and consistency around wastewater treatment standards to get ahead of this bow wave of upcoming consents. As many people on this call will be aware, our wastewater infrastructure is old and in some places degraded. A lot of it is over 30, 40 years old and in need of upgrade or replacement. We're also in a time of population growth and urban development, so people are looking at their infrastructure needs for their communities, with some larger communities and housing areas needing new treatment plants. So it was very timely, we thought, to put these standards in place. We know that consenting and infrastructure upgrades are expensive. In many ways, some of it around the time it takes and needing to have consultants and legal advice, as well as the infrastructure itself. And our intention was to provide some standardization, that certainty and consistency, which would drive efficiencies, reduce the time it will take to get consents, and help network operators as they plan their infrastructure upgrades over the next few years. And so I've already touched on this a bit, but what are the benefits we see in the standards? So one of the things that we thought really hard about was how we needed to balance three goals, and you'll see them there on the slide. So the standards need to improve public health and environmental health outcomes. They need to meet community aspirations, but they have to be affordable. We know that infrastructure is expensive, and we know that consenting can be expensive and time consuming. So we were looking to balance those three goals the best we could to have something that was practical and effective. And you'll see there a list of some of those benefits. In terms of cost efficiencies, we've done some case studies. You can find those on our website. And what they have found is that through standardization, we're looking at probably around a 40% up to 60% reduction in the cost of consenting. So that will be quite a considerable saving for many councils. And that covers things like reductions in staff time, technical and feasibility assessments, legal costs. And then over time, we're expecting to see other efficiencies through the standardization of infrastructure and the operations themselves. We also expect to see improvements in the level of public transparency through improved monitoring and reporting, which means that the public can have greater assurance about the effectiveness of their wastewater services, as well as seeing some improvements in public health and environmental outcomes. Through better reporting and monitoring, you should get better and easier compliance and enforcement for the primary regulator, the regional councils. So we see a suite of benefits through these standards, and we will be very closely monitoring the effectiveness to make sure that we are getting those benefits over the next few years as the standards are adopted and rolled into upcoming consents. So I'm going to pause now, and I'm going to hand over to Janelle, who's going to talk a bit more about the process before we get into the detail of the standards themselves. So thanks, over to you, Janelle.
Thanks, Sarah. Kia ora, everybody. I'm Janelle. I am part of the policy team here at Taumata ROI. So we just thought that some of you might already be aware, but we would recap on the process that we took to develop the standards, and a little bit of an update around changes that we made following consultation and the scope of the standards. So the standards draw on an analysis of existing consent arrangements, and they also were based on significant independent technical advice. We tested the proposals through consultation from February to April of this year, and through that process we got over 150 submissions from councils, industry stakeholders, iwi and hapu, and also from individuals. So based on the feedback received from the consultation, we made quite a few refinements to the standards and commissioned further technical advice to support that. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Sorry. Commissioned further technical advice and also spoke in detail to some operators, iwi and communities about their individual circumstances. So now we go to the next slide, and we just summarize some of the kind of themes and changes that came out of that process. So the changes that that you might have noticed to the standards from what you would have seen at the consultation stage, in discharge to water, we adjusted the treatment requirements for marine discharges, and we extended the transition periods for the existing discharges. There was clarification of the monitoring frequency requirements, and then provisions added for exceptional circumstances. In discharge to land, we refined the loading rate thresholds, increased the flexibility for seasonal variations, and just clarified those application area calculations as well. And then in biosolids, we made an adjustment to align the containment limits with international standards. And we also clarified the beneficial use pathways. And across all of these standards, we also kind of streamlined the reporting requirements. And then just in the overflows and bypasses, we clarified the emergency overflow provisions and enhanced the public notification requirements that really drive the transparency aspect of that overflow standard. Across the full set, the kind of general improvements were in the transition timeframes, clarification of the compliance pathways, and a little bit of enhanced kind of guidance. We also strengthened the treaty settlement provision. So I come to that in the next slide. Under our legislation, if we can just go ahead to the next slide. Oh, I've forgotten one. So I'll quickly cover when the standards apply before we go ahead to that treaty settlement one. The standards apply to publicly owned wastewater plants and networks, and that's set in our primary legislation. And just we do always like to emphasize the standards are not intended to apply to private networks or on-site wastewater treatment systems. And so we've specified the this standard as like the parameters for that scope of application. And now we can move on to this very wordy slide around the treaty settlement obligations. Basically, we just kind of wanted to cover really comprehensively in this presentation an update that was made in the standards following the consultation. So under our primary legislation, we have specific treaty settlement obligations that we must uphold in the Waikato, Waipa, Whanganui and Whangaehu catchments. So the standards will apply in these catchments unless there is an inconsistency with the relevant treaty settlement acts. And where an inconsistency is identified, the iwi and hapu in that catchment will work with the network operator and the consenting authority to consider the application of the standards to make sure that the treaty settlement provisions can also be upheld. So for Waikato Waipa, the primary legislation that was passed earlier this year has made amendments to provide for this arrangement. So we've specified the relevant sections of the ledge here, but basically the impact is that the River Settlement Act and the Te Ture Whaimana Vision and Strategy for the Waikato River will prevail over any inconsistent provision in a wastewater standard. And then the regulations themselves have applied that approach to the Whanganui and Whangaehu catchments. So further information about the specific treaty settlement acts can be found on our website, but hopefully that's been a reasonably comprehensive explanation of that update. And from there, I think I am now handing over to my colleague Marcus to take you through the details of the standards.
Kia ora, thanks, Janelle. Kia ora whānau, I'm Marcus Bishop. I've been part of the team that's been developing these standards across the last year. And I have the pleasure today of sort of deep diving the details of the standards with you all. So I'm going to touch on sort of the key mechanics and features of each of the standards and give you a bit of a background to those elements. And hopefully you will leave with just perhaps a bit more of a firm understanding of what's in the standards, how they are intended to work, and you can go forth and conquer in the implementation of them. So without further ado, jumping into the discharge to water standard. So the standard covers the discharges of treated wastewater from wastewater treatment plants to any given water body. And the key features of this standard, we have exceptions. So it will not apply in every single circumstance. What we've got is sort of specific exclusions, say for discharges to water bodies near drinking water intakes, or to certain water bodies such as pristine waters, geothermal waters, or karst systems. Should a proposed discharge ever arise in these circumstances, it will revert back to whatever consenting or permitting framework is applicable at the time. Should you find yourself with a proposed discharge that is covered by the standards, the sort of key mechanics and key implementation points of the standard is, firstly, water bodies have been divided up into separate receiving environment categories. We have 9 of these. We've got 4 marine coastal or marine environments, open ocean, high energy coastal, low energy coastal, and estuaries. And these have been defined through physical characteristics, really. So an example of that being the open ocean is a discharge whose outfall point is 500 meters out to shore and covered by at least 10 meters of water throughout the entire tidal cycle. Our freshwater environments have been chunked up into 4 separate categories: very low, medium, and high dilution environments. And an operator and consenting authority will go through the process of determining the sorts of anticipated volumes of effluent to be discharged across the life cycle of a consent, and historic low flow data in the receiving water body to determine what sort of dilution environment that discharge will be going into. So those are our receiving environments, sort of the first step in implementing the standard. Once you've nailed that, you'll drop down into actually applying some concentration limits. So these will be end of pipe concentration limits for common contaminants in treated wastewater. So we've covered 7 of the most common contaminants with the potential for adverse effects in the environment and in the standards. And what have we got? We've got total suspended solids, CBOD 5, carbonaceous oxygen demand across a 5-day period, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, ammoniacal nitrogen, which is the nasty toxicity one, and then either enterococci or E. coli, depending on if you're in a fresh or saltwater environment. And the concentration limits for those contaminants within the treated wastewater are dependent on which receiving environment that you are discharging into. And those limits have all been developed through taking existing receiving environment or in-water guidelines or contact recreation limits and back calculating those with the anticipated mixing or dilution that you expect to achieve in each of those receiving environments. So step 2 of the process, another step coming in, we needed to account for particularly sensitive receiving environments. And so hard bottom streamed where there is the potential for exacerbating periphyton effects or nuisance effects or adverse impacts. We have developed a periphyton risk assessment process. So find yourself with a proposed discharge to a hard bottom stream, which is defined in the standards as a sort of an environment that is the substrate is made up with 50% or more of gravel size or larger particles. You trigger the need to go and do this periphyton risk assessment. SWEPs will come in and assess the risk of the discharge on the potential for periphyton growth, and then you'll subsequently have alternative limits for your total nitrogen and phosphorus on the back of that risk assessment. Similarly, shellfish gathering and increased sort of risk activity around proposed discharge sites. So if you're within this 4K radius of a shellfish gathering site, you need to go and do this quantitative microbial risk assessment. Again, that brings in SWEPs and looks at the pathogens of concern within your treated wastewater, their fate in the environment after treatment and dispersion, how that will bioaccumulate in shellfish, and then what sort of habits are attached to those sites, and how the quantities of shellfish being ingested, and the risks of illness. And you'll come up with some mitigations or alternative pathogen limits in response to that. So those were the two sort of risk assessment processes that were built into the standards to provide more protections for these specifically sensitive environments. So boom, we've gone receiving environments, you've got your concentration limits, you've got your site-specific risk assessments for sensitive environments. The standards then impose some nationally consistent monitoring requirements. So these are things like you must monitor at the end of pipe after your full treatment process, but before mixing with any other discharges or waters. These are things like the frequency of monitoring. So larger plants serving 10,000 or more people, daily at least monitoring, and less frequent monitoring for smaller plants. And then the analysis of this sort of sampling. So all your sampling needs to go to a IANZ accredited laboratory to get your results tested, for example. So creating a bit more of a nationally consistent approach to the monitoring requirements for these treated wastewater discharges. Similarly, we are looking to require a more consistent approach to reporting. So again, it's sort of tailored to the size of plant, but every wastewater treatment plant discharging to water will now either have to do monthly or quarterly and annual reporting, and that will go to consenting authorities, be made on a publicly accessible website and provided to the water services, Taumata Arawai. And that will cover things such as providing all of the raw sampling results, summary of compliance against these concentration limits and any other limits that are imposed in the consents, and any information of any non-compliances and subsequent enforcement action that would be taken in the back of that. What else do we find in the discharge water standards? So we have a lot of small remote wastewater treatment plants throughout the country, and they face unique challenges in that they are maybe way out in the WOPs. They might not have all of the infrastructure that you would expect with a wastewater treatment plant. Perhaps they don't even have power. So in our sort of requirement to impose proportionate responsibilities on these operators, we've developed a small plant standard. So this is intended to provide for those treatment plants that serve less than 1,000 people, and subsequently the scale of discharge in the environment is significantly less than those larger treatment plants throughout the country, and they have tailored requirements in terms of less frequent monitoring requirements, given that they're out in the remote and potentially difficult to impose more frequent monitoring, and no nutrient treatment requirements is the big one there. So those have been developed to assist those small treatment plants. And then the sort of final key feature of this standard is that in many instances there are existing treatment plants out there with less stringent limits currently, and that are going to have to up their performance to meet the requirements of the standards. So regional councils will have the discretion to provide a sort of 5-year period upon granting consent under the standards for these treatment plants to be able to go up and do those upgrades as required. So that is your discharge to water standard in a nutshell. I'm going to give you 10 seconds just to mull over that and give me some time to have a piece of some water, because we're going to go into discharge to land next. Rightio. So discharge to land standard, as it says in the name, this is to cover discharges of treated wastewater from wastewater treatment plants to land. Again, the sort of key features and mechanics of the standard, we have discharge to land specific exceptions, and these cover things like discharges to land that may have an adverse effect on sites of cultural significance, or discharges to land that are deemed unsuitable after going through the process of the standard requires. So the crux of this standard it really is all around this sort of site classification process. So proposed site to receive treated wastewater discharge will be given a class of land. We've got it, and that will either be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the process for determining what class of land you sit in is done through this site classification process, and it's two-pronged. You've got a risk assessment over here. So you'll get your SQEPs, your suitably qualified and experienced practitioners. You get a bunch of them in, and they're going to look at the risks of discharging treated wastewater to a site. And these will be things like the runoff of nitrogen or phosphorus into waterways causing eutrophication types of things, or the risk of the public becoming ill through exposure to E. coli, say, from a wastewater treatment plant discharged to land. So you'll go through that process, you'll assess all of these individual risks, you'll aggregate all of that, and that'll give you an overall risk classification for your proposed site. So that'll sit over here. The other side to this assessment process is a site classification or a site capability assessment. And that's going to look at things like the drainage of the site, or the slope of the site, or the soil moisture and distance to groundwater. So the actual physical characteristics of the site and what that means in terms of its ability to receive and assimilate treated wastewater. You'll go through that process, you'll get a site capability score, you're going to put that together with your site risk score, and that's going to give you your class of land, being either that 1, 2, 3, or 4. Depending on your class of land, you then drop down and you've got your limits. So the discharge to land standard has loading rates or loading application limits for total nitrogen and phosphorus in a year, and it has E. coli concentration limits, and those differ depending on what class of land you are. Class 4, it means that a site has been taken through the process and it is deemed unsuitable, so it actually falls into an exception to the discharge to land standards. So just a little tidbit there. But anyway, you've gone through the site classification, you've got your class of land, you've got your application limits for total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and then E. coli. And then it's similar to sort of discharge to water standard in that the standard will require some nationally consistent monitoring requirements. And these are essentially quite minimalist at this point in time, to just simply create the baseline or establish the baseline data for the so that operators and consent authorities can understand the impacts of this scheme, and that is around soil testing and monitoring and groundwater testing and monitoring. The full suite of monitoring requirements will still be developed up by the SQEPs and consent authorities in developing and considering consent applications. Again, we've got reporting requirements, which depending on the size of your wastewater treatment plant will depend on whether you're doing monthly, quarterly, and annual reporting. And again, that's going to be raw data from your testing, a summary of compliance against these limits and anything else in your consent, information around non-compliance and any enforcement action. And these will be going to the Consent Authority, made available on a publicly accessible website and provided to Taumata Arawai as the overseer of the wastewater sector. Discharge to land is slightly different to discharge to water in that it will require the development of a management plan and an operations and maintenance plan to accompany a scheme, just to ensure that these schemes are being managed and operated as required and appropriately to ensure that the adverse effects are kept to a minimum. And then again, similar to discharge to water, provision for regional councils to provide up to 5 years for any infrastructure upgrades that will need to be put in place to achieve compliance with the standards and consent. So yeah, discharge to land. I'll have another quick break. The reuse of biosolids standard. So just to set the scene for this, for anyone that may not be aware, the biosolids are a product or a byproduct of the wastewater treatment process, really. So the sludges from oxidation ponds and all the residual solids from the wastewater treatment process, you gather those together and then you take them through an additional treatment process, and the byproduct that you're left with is sort of termed biosolids. So the reuse of biosolids standards is intended to create a pathway for this byproduct to be reused beneficially throughout the country. And it does so based on the existing Modern New Zealand guidelines for the reuse of biosolids. And it's really sort of chunked up into two key features or mechanics. So the first being a grading framework for biosolids products. So depending on the process that has been taken to treat these residual solids and turn them into biosolids, depending on the contaminant levels and pathogen levels in that product, the biosolid itself will get a grade of A1, A2, B1, B2, or does not meet grade. So that's the grading framework that's been adopted, and that then flows down into some rules for its reuse, some nationally consistent rules. So we have a permitted activity pathway for A1 biosolids on the assumption that they can meet all of the permitted activity standards and conditions. If they can't, or you're a B1 biosolid, you've got a controlled activity pathway. And then if you can't meet that, or you're not the appropriate biosolid product, then we have a discretionary activity pathway for the reuse of these biosolids. We see these sort of mirrored in a few regional plans throughout the country. Auckland's got a good example. Waikato has one as well. So that's the crux of the biosolids standard. And just a caveat, we have been made kindly aware of a typographical error in the standard where in the grading alluding to sort of the requirement to be less than or more than 2% nitrogen in the actual biosolid product. So just to give anyone on the call a little bit of comfort in that's been picked up amongst other things and is on our radar to address. Yeah, so I think I'll move on to the last standard, our overflows and bypass standard. So just to set a bit of context to this one too, overflows in of themselves are regulated in a very fragmented way throughout the country. So what you can see is there are some permitted activity pathways if an overflow is designed in a certain way, right the way through to sort of prohibited activities in a number of regional plans. But what we know is that simply because an activity is prohibited, in this instance overflows, doesn't mean that they're not happening. In fact, we know that they are happening. So a prohibited activity in the regional plan means that you are unable to get consent for it, and because you are unable to get consent for it, there's no sort of regulatory framework for the management of these things. So essentially, this standard is seeking to establish this nationally consistent controlled activity pathway so that overflows have a pathway to be consented. And in establishing that pathway, we can prescribe some nationally consistent monitoring and reporting requirements on those overflows. It's essentially there to raise the bar to a minimum point in the management of overflows throughout the country. So how does it do that? It does that through creating a controlled activity for existing engineered overflow points, controlled activity for uncontrolled overflow points, and a controlled activity for bypasses from wastewater treatment plants. So all of these things now will be consented as a controlled activity. And in establishing that controlled activity pathway, we have created minimum information requirements that will need to accompany the consent applications. And so this is the need to go out and map these known overflow points as part of your application and do a risk assessment of these overflow points. And the risk assessment needs to consider things like the possible public and environmental impacts, the frequency, and are there sort of publicly accessible spaces where these overflows are occurring. And after that assessment, each overflow point will need to be classified as low, medium, or high risk. That classification will then flow on into some mandatory monitoring and reporting requirements. So, for example, if you classified, well, not you, but if an overflow is classified as high risk, then it will need telemetric monitoring installed on that overflow point. And then the reporting requirement attached to that is every time that it does overflow, that will need to be reported within 2 hours of the operator becoming aware. So it's a bit of a feel for the mechanics of this overflow and bypasses standard. A good one to note here is that this doesn't come into effect or force until December 2028. And the key reason behind this was to the ability to align the requirements of stormwater risk management plans with wastewater risk management plans, and then how these things all sort of meld together into a beautiful risk-based approach for the management of overflows. So yeah, I hope that has all been informative and helpful and not too much of an info dump on everyone. And that is my part of the presentation finished. So I'll now hand over to Simone Palmer to take us over from here.
Kia ora, Marcus, and kia ora koutou. I'm Simone Palmer. I have the pleasure of being part of the team that helped develop these wastewater standards. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll start off by talking about how the standards will be implemented. So the standards will be implemented through future resource consents as they come up for renewal. Requirements in the standards do not apply retrospectively. So what that means in practice is that conditions in existing consents will continue to apply until that relevant consent expires. So what does it look like when the standards are implemented? The standards are applied through consent conditions. For discharges to land and water, activity status will continue to be set through the relevant regional plan. So operators should consult their regional plans ahead of determining what the nature and the location of the discharge is. So for example, whether they're discharging to water or land. They'll also need to consult with communities in making those decisions and preparing their consent applications. However, the standards are going to streamline these conversations significantly, and they limit the matters that are up for debate. Requirements in the standards, which Marcus has talked us through, such as treatment limits and monitoring requirements, will be directly inserted into those future consents as conditions. When something's prescribed in the standards, consent authorities cannot impose different conditions. So they cannot impose more stringent or less stringent treatment limits, for example. However, there are some aspects that aren't covered by the standards. So heavy metals at this stage aren't covered in our discharge to land and water standards. And where this is the case, the regional councils the relevant regional council has the discretion to impose a limit on a site-specific basis. Marcus has already mentioned a minor typo in the biosolids standard, and thank you to those people who have reached out to us and told us about some drafting errors that need to be fixed. Some of these are very minor, and we have mechanisms to deal with them quite quickly. And from our side, we're working through how to best address them and really identify how quickly they need to be resolved so that we can pick them up and make sure the standards are implemented as soon as possible. Just invite you all to please get in touch with us if you do become aware of any technical errors. We will share a contact email address at the end of this session. Finally, I'll just touch on some aspects of the standards that may need to change with proposed resource management changes. So Marcus has talked us through the overflows and biosolid standards. And in both of those, controlled activity status is a feature of what those standards do. However, that's something that may be removed in the future RM system. So we are working with DIA. We're also working with Ministry for the Environment to understand what those changes will mean for the standards and how we pick them up through consequential amendments in future. Next slide, please. Lovely. So alongside the 4 standards that Marcus took us through, the standards also introduce a time limit for operating on expired consents. And this is a significant improvement to the current system because, as Sarah mentioned right at the beginning, we've got over 20% of our publicly owned and operated treatment plants already operating on expired consents. This is something that's enabled through the current system, so Section 124 enables it, but what it means in practice is that those wastewater treatment plants are often operating on consents that are no longer fit for purpose because they were granted many decades ago. I know of one case, for example, where a wastewater treatment plant has been operating on an expired consent for 24 years, which is a significantly long time. So our standards will introduce a time cap on how long treatment plants can rely on expired consents, and that will be a 2-year time limit. However, we know that operators will need time to understand and plan for what those future consents are and obtain those new consents. So this requirement won't come into force for 3 years, meaning there'll be an initial 5-year window. Next slide, please. Great. So alongside the requirements in the standards, there are also general transition arrangements that apply. And a question that we often get is whether and how the standards apply to a consent application that's already in train or that's already been submitted. Whether the standards apply in that case depends on whether a notification decision has been made. So if a notification decision has been made, the standards do not apply. However, if a notification decision has not been made, then the standards will apply. We also have a number of consents that have recently expired or are very soon due to expire. And these consents will automatically be extended for roughly 3 years. So they'll be extended to August 2028. And the intent of this provision is it's good regulatory practice, really. So it's to give time to those operators to plan and fund the upgrades that may be required to meet the standards and to apply for new consents. I will pause there and I will hand back to Sarah, who is going to talk about what is next for us.
Thanks, Simone, and thank you, Marcus, Simone and Janelle. A huge amount of work done by a small team here, and as I mentioned earlier, with a lot of people on this call as well. So I hope people have got a lot out of this session, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about what next and where you can find further information. So we've given you an overview of what's in the standards and reflected on what we've changed since we consulted broadly, and that engagement we had with councils and others on the proposed standards. But what is really important is making sure that these are implemented well. And so we're looking at a number of steps to support the implementation of the standards. So we've already put some guidance on our website, and we'll be continuing to roll out guidance over the next few months for the different standards. We'll also be looking at what national training might be useful and how to support network operators through communities of practice or other tools such as online compliance tools and calculators. So we will be working really hard with the sector on how to implement these effectively. And if you have any ideas about what would be really useful, please reach out to us. We're really keen to hear from you about that. We talked, as we looked at the standards, we talked about the importance of reporting and monitoring the standards. So we'll be looking at what we can do on a sort of national level about performance reporting, and also looking at benchmark data, which I think will be of real interest, not just to the sector, but to the public, about how wastewater standards are working and how people's treatment plants are performing. And we'll continue to engage broadly with all parties, so our iwi, hapu, our communities, councils, regional authorities, as we go through this implementation phase. And obviously we want to know how the standards are performing so that we can look at what we need to do in terms of gaps or improvements. So one of the things we heard through the consultation was a request for us to look at what else could be standardised and brought within this suite of standards. So, for instance, at the moment, discharge to air is not covered by the standards, and Simone already mentioned that heavy metals and PFAS are not covered by the standards, and so they will be sitting in the existing consenting pathway approach. So we will look at a future work programme about what other standards might be appropriate and deliver value and benefits to the system. So we are keen to hear from others about any potential ideas. We've got some, and we've talked to a few people about them and picked up quite a bit through consultation, but we're keen to hear about what would be of most value to you. And so we are going to just kind of reflect on some of the FAQ that came through registrations and that we've heard quite a bit. And then finally, we're going to end, and I'm going to share a website so that all of these, any other further suggestions on this future work programme, on what you need in terms of guidance and support, will come back so you can reach out to us. But before we do that, we're just going to cover off some of the things that may not have come through strongly in the description of the different standards, but that we've picked up through either your questions in registration or through some of our other engagements. And so I'm going to hand over first to Janelle to cover off a couple of those key things.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, hi again, everyone. So the FAQs that I just really wanted to cover off, one thing that we have been asked quite a bit is whether cumulative effects on aquatic ecosystems are addressed under the standards. And so maybe it's kind of quite clear by now, having listened to the presentation, but the standards set end of pipe limits for discharges, and they're not, like, in that way, they're not designed to address cumulative effects. The catchment planning and management of cumulative effects will remain a responsibility of regional councils. So that function of catchment planning in the future will need to take into account the discharges that are compliant with the standards. So we're absolutely not losing the catchment management. The standards are very tightly scoped to reflect the performance of wastewater treatment plants themselves, which, as I'm sure you would appreciate, has quite significant monitoring and compliance benefits. So the other one that I thought would be good to talk about from my perspective is a question around how will communities, including iwi and hapu, be involved in determining wastewater arrangements moving forward? Because obviously the standards are specifying quite a lot of the infrastructure operating requirements. So the community relationships with network operators will still influence decisions about discharges, like their nature, whether they are discharges to water or land, and also the location of discharges. So absolutely that will still involve working with communities, with iwi and hapu. A consent cannot be contrary to the standards unless very specific exemptions apply, most of which we've touched on today. Where an exception applies, then the relevant matters will be decided by the regional council under what we kind of have been referring to as the existing RM system, but which itself may see some changes in the future. So those were my priority ones to cover off. I'll hand over to Marcus now.
Hold up, me again. Marcus, do the standards enable discharge of raw sewage to the ocean? Great question. No, they do not. So open ocean discharges have limits on total suspended solids, ammoniacal nitrogen, and E. coli, all of which, when you look at them holistically, no raw sewage will meet. So absolutely not. The standards do not allow raw sewage to be discharged to the open ocean. I think just to address the origins of these concerns, so if you look singularly at ammoniacal nitrogen, it could be comparable to what you may see in some raw sewage, but you need to look at the limits that are imposed on those discharges holistically and all of the contaminants that they cover. So no, they do not allow raw sewage to be discharged to the ocean. What's my other question? What is the process if the standards cannot be met? Does the project fall back to the activity standards under the relevant regional plan? Okay, so contextualizing this question, you have a proposed discharge that comes within the scope of the standards, so the standards apply. You go through the process to determine what limits would apply to that proposed discharge under the standards, and you figure out that that proposed discharge could not comply with those standards either immediately or after the time period allowed by regional council. So in that instance, consent cannot be granted. The proposed discharge cannot meet the requirements of the standard, and so no consent will be granted for that discharge. And yeah, kia ora, Simone.
Hi everyone. So I've got the final two questions that we are commonly asked. So one relates to, again, discharges to water over land, and the question that we have been asked is, are you incentivizing discharges to water over land? No, the standards are not designed to do this. So we've taken a very strong risk-based approach to developing the standards, which means there are more stringent requirements for more sensitive environments in both water and land. And decisions about the location and the nature of those discharges, so whether it's to land or whether it's to water, will continue to sit with network operators. And as I mentioned earlier, they will have to work together with their communities to make those decisions. Just one final question. Are PFAS and other emerging contaminants adequately covered in biosolids grading? So yes, PFAS considerations are included in the grading requirements and loading rate restrictions for biosolids. And these requirements reflect recent direction from the Australian and New Zealand environmental protection agencies. So those recommendations informed what was in the Water New Zealand guidelines for biosolids reuse, and those guidelines have informed what's in our standard. I'll just quickly touch on PFAS and emerging contaminants in the other areas. So Sarah mentioned this briefly. PFAS isn't regulated at the moment through the other standards, but we may pick it up in future. So it's a bit of a watching brief for us at this stage. Great, and I will hand back to Sarah.
Okay, this is our final slide, and you will see here a reasonably long email address, but we are really keen to hear from you. So please reach out if you have questions, or you've spotted something, or you want extra guidance on this email address. So it's stormwater, that's an underscore that you can't see very well there, wastewater@taumata-arawai.govt.nz. Also, please just look at our website. There are contact details on there too. We will continue to update the guidance over the next few months and put other resources up there too. There's already an enormous amount of information up there, including all of the technical reports that have fed into these standards. So there's some really useful content in there, as well as some Q&A and other resources. So please do have a look at that, or reach out on this email address, and we will answer your questions as best we can. So I just want to thank everyone for spending this hour with us. We hope very much that it's been informative. We are feeling very confident that we have managed to balance those three goals I talked about at the beginning, in having standards that will be protective of public health and the environment, that meet community aspirations, particularly in providing that public transparency and assurance that your wastewater treatment plants are performing as they should, and that these standards will bring cost efficiencies and be affordable for those who are looking to upgrade their infrastructure. So big thank you to the team here, but also to all of those online who have helped us develop these standards. I hope everyone has a good end to their week and has a break over the holidays. So thank you all.